There's a moment that happens in certain relationships that no one talks about. It's usually late at night. The room is quiet except for the soft hum of a television nobody is watching, or the sound of traffic bleeding through a half-open window. And you're sitting beside someone you love, someone you've poured pieces of yourself into, someone you've tried to understand with almost painful patience. But somehow, you still feel alone. Not physically alone, emotionally abandoned. You look at them, and they look calm, controlled, untouched. And meanwhile, your chest feels like it's carrying the emotional weight for two people. You replay every conversation, every silence, every moment they pulled away just when things became real. And the terrifying part is this: the more distant they become, the more intensely you feel drawn toward them, as if your soul mistakes emotional unavailability for depth, as if the coldness itself becomes addictive. This is the hidden tragedy of the super empath, not that they love too much, but that they unconsciously become magnets for people who are terrified of love itself. Avoidants, the emotionally unreachable, the ones who crave intimacy until intimacy finally arrives, the ones who want to be seen until someone actually sees them. And somehow, they always find you. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but because there is something ancient happening underneath the surface of both personalities. A silent psychological dance. One person starving for emotional fusion, the other terrified of emotional exposure. And what begins as chemistry slowly becomes emotional gravity. Because super empaths don't just attract wounded people, they attract people who learned long ago that closeness is dangerous. And tonight, we're going to enter the deeper reason why. Because the first reason super empaths always attract avoidance has almost nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with emotional recognition. Keynote 1. Super empaths have a dangerous gift. They can feel people before people speak. Not in some mystical fantasy way, not mind reading, not magic, something far more unsettling than that. They notice emotional microfractures in people that others ignore. The hesitation before someone answers a vulnerable question. The fake smile that arrives half a second too late. The exhaustion hidden underneath confidence. The loneliness disguised as independence. You see what most people overlook, and avoidants spend their entire lives hoping nobody notices those things, until you do. That's the beginning of the bond. Because avoidants are deeply misunderstood people. Most people think avoidants don't care. That's rarely true. What actually lives underneath avoidance is emotional panic. A panic so old they no longer recognize it as fear. Usually it started early. Love became unpredictable. Affection became conditional. Vulnerability became unsafe. At some point, they learned a brutal emotional equation. Need less. Feel less. Depend on nobody, and you'll survive. So they built identities around self-containment. Control became safety. Distance became peace. And emotional independence became a form of armor. But then they meet you. And for the first time in years, somebody looks at them and says nothing, yet somehow understands everything. That feeling is intoxicating to an avoidant. Because super empaths create emotional permission without words. You don't force people open, you make them feel accidentally exposed. And avoidants are drawn to that the way exhausted people are drawn to warmth. But here's where the tragedy quietly begins. Because the super empath often mistakes emotional access for emotional intimacy. Those are not the same thing. An avoidant opening up to you does not mean they know how to stay emotionally connected. It only means they feel unusually safe in one moment. And super empaths live for those moments. You become addicted to the glimpses, the rare, vulnerable confession, the sudden emotional honesty at 2 a.m., the unexpected tenderness after weeks of distance. Those tiny moments feel enormous to you because they feel earned. You think, there's something real underneath all of this. And there is. That's what makes this dynamic so psychologically devastating. The connection is real, the care is real, but consistency is missing. And the human nervous system can become addicted to inconsistent emotional reward faster than almost anything else, especially empathetic people. Because your mind starts chasing emotional resolution. You begin trying to decode them, save them, reach them, understand them deeply enough that maybe one day they'll stop running. But avoidants often fall in love in fragments. They move toward connection, then panic once connection becomes emotionally real. So the closer you get, the more distance suddenly appears. And to a super empath, that distance feels personal. You start questioning yourself quietly. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I became too emotional. Maybe I should be softer, quieter, less needy, less intense. But what's actually happening has very little to do with your worth. You're standing in front of someone whose nervous system associates intimacy with danger, and your emotional depth activates both their deepest longing and their deepest fear. That contradiction creates confusion neither of you fully understand at first. Because avoidants are often deeply affectionate in the beginning, present, attentive, curious, until the emotional attachment becomes undeniable. That's when the invisible wall appears. And super empaths almost always react the same way. They lean in harder. Not because they're weak, because they can feel the pain behind the distance. You sense the wounded child underneath the avoidance. You sense the fear underneath the silence. You sense the love underneath the withdrawal. And your instinct is to reach for it. But the more emotionally available you become, the more exposed the avoidant begins to feel. Until suddenly, the relationship starts feeling like emotional tug-of-war between closeness and escape. One person saying, "Please stay," the other silently whispering, "Please don't get too close." And somewhere inside that painful dance, the super empath slowly begins abandoning themselves without realizing it. Because when you spend too long trying to emotionally rescue someone who fears intimacy, you eventually forget who rescues you. And that is where the second reason begins. There is something super empaths rarely admit out loud. Sometimes, you don't fall in love with people. You fall in love with potential. With the hidden version of someone. The version buried underneath the defense mechanisms, the emotional distance, the silence, the contradictions. You see fragments of who they could become if they ever felt safe enough to fully open. And once you see that version, you cannot unsee it. That is why avoidance becomes so emotionally consuming to super empaths. Because avoidants are unfinished stories, emotionally encrypted people, and your mind keeps trying to solve them like a puzzle that promises emotional treasure hidden at the center. You notice things others miss. The softness beneath their sarcasm, the exhaustion beneath their independence, the tenderness hidden inside their restraint. And every once in a while they reveal it to you. A vulnerable sentence, a trembling truth, a look in their eyes that says, "I want to trust you, but I don't know how." That moment becomes everything. Because for a super empath, emotional depth feels sacred. You don't connect through surface-level interaction. You connect through emotional revelation. So when an avoidant briefly lets you into their inner world, it feels profoundly intimate, almost spiritual. But here is the psychological trap. The rarity of emotional access increases its emotional value. The less often they open up, the more meaningful it feels when they finally do. And your nervous system begins attaching enormous significance to very small moments. A delayed text suddenly feels monumental. A rare, vulnerable conversation feels life-changing. A tiny display of affection feels like proof the relationship is evolving. Meanwhile, you slowly begin surviving on emotional breadcrumbs without realizing it. Because inconsistency creates obsession. Human beings are wired this way. The unpredictable reward pattern keeps the emotional attachment alive. It's the same psychological mechanism behind addiction. Your brain starts anticipating emotional closeness the way thirsty people anticipate rain, and avoidants often give just enough intimacy to keep hope alive. Not maliciously, not intentionally. Most avoidants are fighting themselves more than they're fighting you. That's the heartbreaking part. They often mean every loving word when they say it. But emotions that feel safe one day can feel terrifying the next. So they retreat. And every retreat activates something primal inside the super empath. Not anger first. Fear. The fear of emotional disconnection. The fear that love is slipping away. The fear that if you could just explain yourself better, love them better, understand them deeper, they would finally stay emotionally present. So you overextend. You become more patient than you should be, more forgiving than is healthy, more emotionally available than the relationship can safely hold. And slowly, almost invisibly, your identity starts revolving around their emotional availability. Your mood depends on their warmth. Your peace depends on their reassurance. Your nervous system begins living in reaction to their distance. That's when love quietly transforms into emotional survival. And super empaths are especially vulnerable to this because your greatest strength becomes your greatest weakness. You can emotionally humanize people who hurt you. You see the wound behind the behavior. So instead of asking, "Why am I tolerating this?" you ask, "What pain made them this way?" That question changes everything. Because once empathy overrides self-protection, boundaries begin dissolving. You excuse emotional inconsistency. You rationalize neglect. You minimize your own loneliness. Not because you lack intelligence, because you have too much emotional understanding. You understand them so deeply that you accidentally stop understanding yourself. And avoidants feel this. Consciously or unconsciously, they recognize that you keep emotionally staying even when they pull away. That creates a dangerous dynamic. The avoidant becomes emotionally pursued. The empath becomes emotionally consumed. One runs from emotional engulfment. The other runs from emotional abandonment. And both people unintentionally trigger each other's deepest wounds. This is why these relationships often feel so intense so quickly. It's not always love creating the intensity. Sometimes it's unresolved attachment pain recognizing itself in another human being. Two nervous systems trying to survive each other while calling it connection. And the super empath keeps holding on because they remember the beginning. The version of the avoidant that felt open, present, emotionally reachable. You keep waiting for that person to come back consistently. But what you don't realize yet is that the beginning was never fake. It was simply unsustainable for someone terrified of intimacy. And once you finally understand why avoidants pull away hardest immediately after emotional closeness, everything changes. The most confusing thing about avoidance is not their distance, it's their timing. They don't always pull away when things are bad. They pull away when things become emotionally real. That's the part that breaks the super empath's heart. Because just when you think the relationship is deepening, just when the walls finally seem to be falling, just when you feel genuine closeness forming, something shifts. Their energy changes. Texts become shorter. Warmth becomes inconsistent. Presence becomes fragmented. And you sit there wondering what happened. You replay the last conversation 100 times, searching for the moment you ruined everything. But often nothing wrong happened at all. In fact, the relationship may have become too right, too intimate, too emotionally visible, too emotionally important. And for someone with avoidant attachment, emotional importance can feel terrifying. Because intimacy does something dangerous to avoidants. It threatens the identity they built to survive. Most avoidants learned very early that vulnerability creates pain. So they adapted. They became self-sufficient, detached, controlled. They convinced themselves they didn't need much emotionally because needing people once hurt too deeply. But then love arrives. Not casual attraction, not flirtation, real attachment. And suddenly, the emotional walls that protected them for years begin cracking open. At first, this feels euphoric. They feel alive around you, seen by you, emotionally awakened by you. Super empaths have a way of making people feel emotionally safe enough to reconnect with parts of themselves they buried long ago. That's why avoidants often become intensely attached to empaths very quickly. You awaken emotions they thought they had outgrown. But awakening emotion is not the same as sustaining intimacy. Because eventually, closeness starts triggering fear instead of comfort. The relationship stops feeling exciting and starts feeling exposing. Now they have something to lose. Now your opinion matters. Your absence matters. Your rejection matters. And avoidants are often deeply uncomfortable with dependency of any kind. So when attachment deepens, their nervous system sounds an internal alarm. This is dangerous. Not consciously. They may not even understand why they suddenly feel overwhelmed. They just know they need space, distance, air. And this is where the super empath usually spirals emotionally. Because your deepest instinct is connection during disconnection. You want to talk things through, repair the distance, understand what changed. But the avoidant experiences emotional pursuit as pressure, even gentle pursuit. The more emotionally intense the conversation becomes, the more trapped they begin to feel. And the cruel irony is this. The empath pursues connection because they fear abandonment. The avoidant withdraws because they fear engulfment. Both people are reacting to fear, but in opposite directions. So the relationship becomes a cycle: closeness, fear, distance, pursuit, withdrawal, reconnection, repeat. And every cycle deepens the emotional addiction. Because intermittent closeness creates powerful emotional imprinting. The reconciliation feels euphoric after the pain of separation. So the nervous system begins confusing relief with love. That's why super empaths often stay far longer than they should. Not because they enjoy suffering, because they keep glimpsing emotional depth that feels incredibly real. And it is real. That's what makes this dynamic so psychologically disorienting. The avoidant may genuinely love you, but love alone does not heal attachment wounds. Someone can care deeply about you and still be emotionally unavailable. Someone can miss you terribly and still withdraw when intimacy returns. Someone can crave connection while simultaneously fearing the vulnerability required to maintain it. That contradiction devastates super empaths because you experience love as emotional presence, consistency, safety, transparency. But avoidants often experience love as vulnerability exposure, and exposure feels unsafe. So the deeper the bond becomes, the stronger their urge to regain emotional control. That's why avoidants sometimes seem cold immediately after moments of deep closeness. Not because intimacy meant nothing to them, because it meant too much. And the super empath rarely understands this at first. You interpret withdrawal as rejection. But many avoidants withdraw because they are emotionally overstimulated. They need distance to regulate feelings they never learned how to process safely. Unfortunately, that distance slowly starves the empath. You begin living in emotional uncertainty, never fully relaxed, never fully secure, always sensing emotional movement underneath the surface. And over time, you start shrinking yourself to maintain connection. You speak softer, need less, ask for less reassurance, hide your hurt, pretend you're okay with emotional inconsistency. Until one day you realize something painful. You've become emotionally lonely inside a relationship. And loneliness inside connection is a very different kind of pain. Because it makes you question your reality. They love you, but you feel unseen. They care, but you feel emotionally abandoned. And somewhere inside that contradiction, the super empath begins waking up to a terrifying truth. Love cannot survive where emotional safety does not exist. Which leads to the final reason this connection becomes almost impossible to escape once it fully takes hold. The final reason super empaths attract avoidance is the hardest one to accept. Because it forces you to stop looking only at them and finally look at yourself. Not with shame, not with blame, but with brutal emotional honesty. Super empaths often believe their deepest wound is loving the wrong people. But sometimes the deeper wound is believing love must be earned through emotional endurance. That if you stay patient enough, understanding enough, selfless enough, you will eventually become impossible to leave. And avoidants unknowingly activate this wound perfectly. Because they rarely give love in stable, predictable ways. Their affection comes in waves. Moments of closeness followed by silence. Intimacy followed by distance. Depth followed by disappearance. To most people, this feels exhausting. But to a super empath, it can feel strangely familiar. Because many empaths learned early in life that love required emotional hyper-awareness. Reading moods, managing tension, anticipating withdrawal, becoming emotionally useful to maintain connection. You became experts at sensing emotional shifts because your nervous system learned that emotional safety depended on it. So when an avoidant enters your life, your empathy doesn't simply activate, your survival instincts do. You start monitoring everything: the tone of their voice, the delay in their responses, the subtle changes in energy, the emotional temperature of every interaction. And eventually, you stop asking one very important question. What do I actually need to feel emotionally safe? Because the relationship becomes centered around preserving connection rather than preserving yourself. That is the hidden danger of being a super empath. You can understand others so deeply that you abandon your own emotional reality. You become compassionate toward behavior that slowly destroys your peace. Not because you're weak, because your heart naturally searches for woundedness before it searches for danger. And avoidants often carry enormous woundedness. That's why these relationships feel so emotionally significant. The empath sees the hidden pain. The avoidant feels deeply understood. For a while, it feels like destiny, like two people healing each other. But healing cannot happen where self-abandonment exists. And eventually, the super empath reaches a breaking point. Not always loudly, sometimes quietly. One exhausted night. One unanswered message too many. One moment where you realize you've spent months trying to feel emotionally chosen by someone who still isn't sure how to choose themselves. And suddenly, something inside you changes. You stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. You stop confusing longing with connection. You stop confusing emotional intensity with intimacy. You stop mistaking potential for partnership. And perhaps for the first time, you understand this. Your ability to deeply understand someone does not obligate you to stay emotionally starving beside them. That realization is transformative, because super empaths often think unconditional love means infinite tolerance. But real love requires safety too, consistency too, presence too, emotional reciprocity too. Without those things, empathy slowly turns into emotional erosion. And the truth is, many avoidants are not bad people. Some are deeply caring, deeply intelligent, deeply wounded. But unless they confront the fears underneath their avoidance, they will continue repeating the same cycle. Craving intimacy, finding intimacy, feeling exposed by intimacy, escaping intimacy. And no amount of love from another person can heal a wound someone is still protecting. That lesson breaks the super empath's heart. Because you saw who they could be. You loved the hidden softness inside them, the frightened child inside them, the vulnerable human being underneath all the emotional armor. But eventually you realize something devastating. You cannot build a relationship with someone's hidden self. You can only build with the version of them that consistently shows up. And that realization marks the beginning of emotional awakening for the empath. Not becoming colder, not becoming less loving, becoming discerning. Understanding that your empathy is sacred energy, not endless emotional labor. Understanding that love should not constantly feel like waiting at the edge of someone else's fear. And perhaps most importantly, understanding that the right relationship will never require you to slowly disappear in order to keep it alive. Because the deepest form of love is not finally convincing someone to stay, it's finally realizing you deserve someone who never makes you question whether they will.